The kitchen was quiet in the early hours, still wrapped in sleep's leftover silence. Helen moved like breath through the space, steady, unhurried. She wore her usual faded apron, the one with fraying edges and a burn mark near the pocket. Her hands worked without thought, peeling, slicing, stirring. In the corner near the prep station sat a small cardboard box, worn and soft at the edges, holding a few tools and a thin, handwritten notebook whose pages had yellowed from years of steam and oil. It was her mother's, and now it was hers, every page a memory. The kitchen lights buzzed above her, soft and pale. The air smelled of butter, onions, and something simmering slowly on the stove. Helen didn't talk much. Most days, she didn't need to. She showed up early, left late, and never asked for more than the work itself. She took her employee meal, the one portion everyone was entitled to, and split it in two, as always. A sandwich today, a little more ham than usual. She added a slice of cheese, tucked in some tomato, wrapped it gently in parchment paper, then placed it in a brown paper bag. She reached into the fridge for a carton of milk and slid that inside too. Finally, she pulled a small note from her pocket, handwritten, soft, cursive, the edges worn, and added it, "Eat well, sweetheart." She folded the top of the bag, ran a piece of tape over it to seal it, and held it close for a moment, like something sacred. Then she exhaled, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked toward the back exit. Outside, the alley behind the restaurant was gray and damp. The air was sharp. Pigeons fluttered on the edge of puddles. She set the brown paper bag gently on an old crate near the dumpster and looked around. Empty. She never saw him this early, but he would come. He always did. Without saying a word, she stepped back inside and returned to the stove. Her coworkers arrived an hour later, clattering voices, someone laughing too loud. Orders started coming in, and the kitchen lit up with noise and motion. Helen moved through it all like a quiet thread. The dishwasher nodded at her. The new server asked her where the mixing bowls were. No one said her name with warmth, but they all knew she was reliable. She didn't gossip. She didn't complain. No one knew what she did every day at noon. No one noticed the second brown paper bag she kept under the counter. She prepared it with the same care. Sometimes it was toasted bread with a boiled egg. Other days it was leftover stew, wrapped in a warm cloth, always with a note. "It might rain today. Find a dry spot, okay?" Or, "I added an extra apple. Eat slowly." At exactly 12, she would walk out to the back again. And there he'd be, small, curled up near the alley wall like a shadow. 7 years old, maybe. His jacket hung off him like it belonged to someone else. His shoes were torn at the toes. He never asked, never begged, never made a sound. He just waited, his hands wrapped around his knees. She walked over, knelt down quietly, and held out the bag. He took it with both hands, bowed his head slightly, and then stood and walked away without looking back. She watched him turn the corner and disappear. The same every day, twice a day, noon and night. A ritual no one else knew existed. Back in the kitchen, she wiped her hands again and went back to work. The manager passed behind her, glanced at the empty spot under the counter. He said nothing but frowned. She knew he'd seen her once, maybe twice. That night, after the dinner rush, she made another meal. This time, hot soup in a thermos, a slice of bread, and a cookie she'd saved from the dessert tray. She wrapped it carefully. Same brown bag, same soft note. "Stay warm tonight, sweetheart." When she opened the back door, the cold had sharpened into something bitter. Her breath came out in clouds. The boy wasn't there. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, soft footsteps. He appeared like a whisper, his eyes barely visible under the hood. She handed him the bag. He didn't speak, just nodded once and vanished again. Weeks passed, then months. He never said his name. She never asked. One day, when she finally did speak, it wasn't to ask where he'd come from. She just said, "Where do you live, honey?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. She tried again, gentler. "What about your mother?" There was silence, then a voice so quiet it barely stirred the air. "She died when I was 5. She said nothing, just placed her hand gently on his shoulder and left the bag in his lap. Inside the restaurant, whispers had started. One of the line cooks rolled his eyes. "She's feeding that street kid again." Another snorted. "If customers see that, it's bad for business." The manager pulled her aside. He wasn't unkind, just cold. "Helen, this isn't a soup kitchen. We're running a business. If this continues, I'll have to talk to the owner." She nodded once, eyes low, said nothing. The manager pulled her aside. He wasn't unkind, just cold. "Helen, this isn't a soup kitchen. We're running a business. If this continues, I'll have to talk to the owner." She nodded once, eyes low, said nothing. The next day, she made the sandwich again. That night, she went home to her small apartment, one bedroom, one chair, a small stove. She heated water for tea, sat in the chair with her mother's notebook in her lap, and flipped through recipes written in the same slanted handwriting she now used on her notes. She lit a candle, not for decoration. The bulb in her lamp had gone out and she hadn't had time to replace it. She sipped slowly, her stomach mostly empty. She'd eaten only half a meal that day. The other half had gone to him, like it always did. At work the next day, she moved slower. Her legs ached. Her hands trembled as she stirred a large pot of soup. Hunger clung to her bones. She hadn't had dinner last night, but when noon came and she heard those soft footsteps near the back door, her face changed. A small smile, as if none of the weariness had ever touched her. She took the paper bag she'd hidden earlier and walked out. He was waiting, cold hands, wide eyes. She gave him the food, and he looked up at her for a split second, the first time he'd met her eyes. Just for a moment, she smiled. He left. She returned to the kitchen. The manager was watching her. This time he didn't say anything, just looked. The boy kept coming, rain or sun. Twice a day, every single day, Helen kept feeding him. Not because she had to, not because anyone would ever know, but because in her quiet world, no child should ever go to bed hungry. That was enough. The rain came down heavy the next morning, thick drops hammering the alley like they were trying to wake the world. Helen stood by the back door, paper bag in hand, her thumb gently tracing the fold line. Inside, a warm roll with eggs, a small container of rice pudding, and the note she wrote the night before. You're stronger than the rain. She looked out. The alley was empty. She waited, heart quieter than usual. A minute passed, and then another. She leaned forward, peering through the mist. No sign of him, nothing but wet concrete and the faint drip of water off a rusted pipe. Lunch hour passed. She worked the grill. Her face was calm, but her eyes moved toward the back every so often. No footsteps, no shadow, just rain. By the time her shift ended, the paper bag was still untouched beneath the counter. She didn't throw it away. She set it in her own tote bag and carried it home. That night, she left it on her small kitchen table unopened. She didn't eat dinner. The next day, she brought 2 meals, one for him, one just in case. Noon came, no sign, evening, still nothing. She waited longer than usual in the alley, shivering. Her coat barely held off the cold. The manager finally noticed the change. You all right, Helen? He asked with a sideways glance. She nodded, same quiet smile. Just tired. On the 4th day, she found a note tucked into the edge of the crate outside. Folded, creased, damp around the corners. Just 2 lines written in blocky, shaky pencil. Got caught. Can't come. I'm okay. She read it 3 times, then pressed it to her chest like a fragile thing that might dissolve. That night, she packed 3 sandwiches, just in case. A week passed before she saw him again. He was thinner, lips cracked, his eyes darker than she remembered. But when she held the brown bag out to him, he took it without hesitation. He didn't sit, didn't linger, just clutched it to his chest and started to walk. She touched his sleeve. You eating every day? He didn't answer. She let him go. Inside, the tension was growing. The head chef had started watching her more closely. The manager had already given a warning. The owner was due for a visit. The dishwasher told her, they think you're stealing inventory. She wasn't. She brought the food from home. Spent her tips buying apples and bread. She didn't tell anyone. She just worked harder, cooked faster, stayed later. One night, after closing, she heard voices outside, angry ones. She stepped out and saw 2 older boys, teens maybe, surrounding the kid. They were laughing. One held his bag just out of reach. You think this is yours? Helen didn't yell. She walked straight to them, fast, her feet soaked in alley water. She looked the biggest one in the eye. Put it down. He hesitated. What, you his mom or something? She didn't answer, just stood there, steady. The other boy muttered something and tossed the bag on the ground. They walked off without looking back. She picked up the food, brushed the wet dirt off the bottom, and handed it to the kid again. His lip was bleeding. He wiped it with his sleeve. She reached into her coat for a tissue and gently dabbed the blood away. He flinched but didn't stop her. Later, when she got home, she cried, quietly, face buried in her arms at the kitchen table. She didn't know why it hurt so much. Maybe because it had been years since anyone had looked at her with that kind of trust, even for a second. The next day at work, the manager called her into the office. I'm sorry, Helen, he said, not meeting her eyes. We're downsizing. Business is slow. We're letting a few people go. She didn't argue. She just nodded. He handed her an envelope. You've been a good worker, really, but it's time. She left before the end of her shift, didn't say goodbye. That evening, she still showed up in the alley. Same time, bag in hand. He came around the corner, saw her standing there, and paused. She held out the food. I don't work here anymore. He looked confused. Then why'd you come? She didn't answer, just gave him the bag. He looked at it, then at her. I could go with you, he said suddenly. It hit her like a soft blow. She knelt, held his gaze. You don't have to say that. I'm just tired, he said, voice cracking. I'm tired of hiding, of being cold. She closed her eyes, then nodded. That night, for the first time, she brought him home. The apartment was tiny, and the heater barely worked, but it was warm enough. She gave him a blanket, a hot meal, and a toothbrush still in its plastic wrap. He sat on the edge of her couch, stunned. He looked around at the small kitchen, the bookshelf full of recipe books, the single chair, and said, You live here alone? She nodded. For a long time. He looked down at his hands, then whispered, Me too. They didn't speak much after that. He curled up under the blanket. She made tea. Later, she wrote a note and tucked it beside his pillow. You're home now. Sleep easy. She sat in the chair all night, watching over him. The next morning, the sun came through the dusty window. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel hungry. She felt full. The knock came 3 days later, not loud, not urgent. Just 3 short raps on the wood, like someone testing if the door was real. She froze, the ladle still in her hand, soup simmering behind her. The boy looked up from the book he was tracing letters in. His shoulders tensed. She put the ladle down slowly and walked to the door, heart beating low and heavy. A man stood there in a blue windbreaker, badge on a lanyard, face tired but calm. Helen Ramos? He asked. She nodded. I'm with Youth Outreach. We've had reports about a missing minor. Can I come in? She hesitated. The boy was already standing behind her, eyes wide, fists clenched at his sides. The man saw him. We're not the police, he said gently. We're just here to help. We just want to make sure he's okay. Helen turned slightly. The boy shook his head once, sharply. She faced the man again. He's safe here, she said. He's eating, sleeping, learning to trust the quiet. The man did smile, but something in his eyes softened. I can see that, but the law still has to check. If you let me talk to him alone, I can make this easier for both of you. She looked at the boy again. He was shaking now, barely. A flicker of something desperate passed between them. She nodded once and stepped aside. The man knelt in front of him, asked his name, then softer questions. How long he'd been on the streets, who he'd left behind, if he wanted to go back. The boy didn't say much, just kept his arms folded tight like they were holding him together. Finally, he whispered, I don't want to leave her. That was all. The man stood up slowly, looked at Helen, and said, I'll need to file this. You'll probably be contacted. You're not in trouble. Yet. But this isn't over. He paused. You should think about guardianship. Something legal. You're not the first person to take in someone like him. But the system isn't built for kindness. After he'd left, the boy didn't ask what would happen next. He just went back to the couch, picked up the book again. She sat across from him, hands folded. The room felt smaller, time slower. That night, she stayed up late with her old laptop, searching terms she didn't understand. Emergency guardianship, youth shelter laws, foster petition forms. Everything was full of forms and fees and warnings. She didn't know where to begin, but she started anyway. They built a rhythm, quiet mornings with oatmeal and toast. She taught him how to chop vegetables without cutting his fingers. He taught her how to fix the crack in her phone screen using tape and heat. Some days he disappeared for hours. She didn't ask where. When he came back, he always had something. A button, a worn-out comic, once a jar of marbles he'd found in an alley box. He left them on the windowsill like gifts. One afternoon, she caught him staring at her while she was sewing up a hole in his coat. Why do you keep helping me? He asked. She didn't look up. Because someone should have helped me once. No one did. He said nothing, but later she found her photo, the one with her mother's handwriting on the back, taped to the fridge door. He'd written below it in shaky pencil, You have me now. A week later, a woman from the city showed up with a clipboard. We need to do a home visit, she said. This is protocol. She checked the water pressure, the pantry, the locks on the windows. The boy stayed close to Helen's side the whole time, like a shadow. The report wasn't perfect. The heater was too old. The couch had a spring poking out. The rent had been paid in 2 months. But when the woman left, she said, You're not a bad home, just a small one. The next day, Helen got a job at a bakery 2 blocks away. Less pay, more hours, but it was something. She brought back day-old croissants and leftover jam. One evening, the boy asked if she could show him how to cook the rice pudding. The one from the first bag, he said. She did. They stood side by side at the stove, steam rising, the smell thick and sweet. He stirred carefully. She guided his hands. When it was done, they sat in silence, eating from chipped bowls. He smiled. It tastes the same. No, she said. It tastes better. He looked at her. Why? She shrugged. Because you helped make it. The letter came on a Thursday. Plain envelope. Government seal. She didn't open it right away. Just stood by the mailbox, the wind picking at her coat, and stared at her name in stiff black ink. Inside the house, the boy was humming. He always hummed when he felt safe. She finally opened it at the kitchen table while the kettle hissed on the stove. Her hands trembled. The paper was brief. Her emergency guardianship petition had been denied. Unfit financial stability, it read. Non-biological relation. Insufficient housing compliance. She read it 3 times. It didn't matter how many warm meals she made, how many school forms she'd filled, how often the boy's nightmares stopped when she whispered his name. On paper, she was nobody. She didn't tell him right away. She couldn't. That night, after he'd gone to bed, she sat in the quiet living room with her mother's old coat wrapped around her and wept like she hadn't in years. Soundless, like something inside her had snapped without warning. But morning still came, and with it, something unexpected. A phone call, a woman's voice on the line, older, measured but kind. Are you Helen Ramos? I'm with a community legal aid clinic. Someone referred your case. Helen blinked. Who? The woman paused. He didn't give a name, just said you gave him warm meals behind a restaurant for years. Said if anyone deserves to keep their family, it's you. Helen pressed her hand to her mouth. Her knees went weak. Over the next few weeks, the legal team helped her refile. They visited, took photos, interviewed neighbors who spoke of Helen as the quiet one who never forgot a birthday, or the lady who brings soup when you're sick. The boy's former shelter records were requested. His school started drafting a letter of support. When the boy learned what had happened, he didn't say anything. He just stood by her side, holding the corner of her sleeve with his fingers, quietly. The day of the hearing, the sky was the color of steel. They sat on the bench outside the courtroom. Helen had braided his hair back neatly that morning. He wore a sweater they'd found at the thrift shop. Inside the courtroom, the judge didn't smile. His glasses sat low on his nose. The state representative listed the reasons she shouldn't qualify. Income too low, housing unstable, not a relative, no precedent for long-term care. Helen stood when asked. Her voice shook but didn't falter. He's my family. No one else came. I didn't ask to become his mother. I just saw a child who needed to eat. The judge looked at the boy. Do you want to stay with her? He didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Why? The boy thought for a long moment. Because she doesn't want anything from me, but she gave me everything. The room went quiet. The judge cleared his throat, scribbled something, then spoke. I'll allow a provisional guardianship. Review in 6 months. For now, he stays. Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The boy reached for her hand under the table, squeezed once. Outside, they didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They just walked together to the corner bakery. She bought him a cinnamon roll and herself a cup of coffee. He leaned into her side on the walk home. That night, she pinned the court document to the fridge beside the old note he'd saved all those years. She whispered, We're still here. He nodded. And we're staying. Life didn't change all at once. It was still tight. Rent still came too quickly, and food sometimes ran short. Helen still walked to work at the corner grocery store, her knees aching in the morning chill, the hours long and standing. She stacked canned soup, wiped down shelves, bagged produce. No one
there knew what she'd done, who she'd raised, or how many nights she went home with her back on fire and her stomach half empty. But she didn't mind, because every night she unlocked the apartment door to find a light on, a pair of shoes by the mat, and a boy, now a young man, at the table scribbling notes beside a worn textbook. He was getting closer to his GED. You're late, he'd mutter, pretending not to look up. And you're stalling, she'd reply. Then they'd smile. That small, quiet smile they both carried. The kind that knew they'd survive things they never named. Then came the letter. Again. But this time it was different. A thick envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Grainy, black and white. A woman with tired eyes and gentle hands holding a newborn. Scribbled in pen across the bottom were the words, his mother. She would have wanted you to have this. There was no signature, just the photo. Helen placed it on the table that night, slid it across. Evan stared at it for a long time. He didn't speak. Then finally, barely above a whisper, I remember her voice. Helen didn't push. She never did. She just reached out and placed her hand over his. That moment might have remained only theirs, quiet, personal, unseen. But a neighbor's daughter, studying journalism at a community college, overheard part of the story. She asked if she could write about them for a class. Helen hesitated. She didn't want attention, but the girl was kind and persistent, so she wrote it, titled it simply, "The Woman Behind the Door." It was published on the school blog. A week later, a local paper reprinted it. Then a larger blog picked it up. Then a TV news anchor tweeted a photo of the original brown paper bag with a note that read, "Today I packed you an extra milk." And just like that, everything shifted. Helen didn't even own a smartphone. She found out the story had gone viral when a customer at the grocery store came in crying, clutching her hand and thanking her for reminding the world what kindness looked like. She blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" The customer pulled up her phone, and there it was. Her name, her story. Within 48 hours, hundreds of thousands of people had read it, commented, shared their own stories of people who had saved them without fanfare. Donations flooded in. A famous chef in New York posted, "This woman fed a child every day for a decade. Let's buy her a restaurant." Helen was stunned. She didn't ask her for anything. She didn't want the spotlight, but something in the world had cracked open. It wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. Evan tried to explain. "People want to believe the world still has someone like you in it." She just shook her head. "I'm just a woman who made sandwiches." He smiled. "Exactly." Soon after, the restaurant she once worked in, the one that fired her without thanks, announced the grand reopening under new ownership. She received a formal invitation in the mail. At first, she thought it was a joke. She planned to ignore it, but Evan insisted, "You should go, just to see." She went, hesitant, just intended to peek through the window, and then she saw it. The new sign carved in deep gold letters, "Helen's Table," where every child has a seat. She stopped. Her breath caught. Then someone stepped outside and asked gently, "Are you Helen? Please come in. Everyone's waiting." She stepped through the door, unsure, and found a space full of warmth, not just from the lighting or the smell of the fresh bread in the air, but from the faces, people who looked at her not with pity, not with surprise, but with a kind of a quiet reverence. She didn't understand. Not yet. 15 minutes later, 5 black Rolls Royces pulled up to the curb, and everything changed again. The crowd hushed. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-bite. Forks paused in the air. The first car door opened. Out stepped a tall man with silver hair, dressed in an understated gray suit that somehow made him look even more commanding. His posture was straight, but there was something heavy about the way he walked, as if every step toward the restaurant cost him decades of regret. He scanned the small crowd inside and then saw her, Helen, standing near the entrance in her old wool coat, her eyes unsure, her hands clasped in front of her, like she was bracing for a storm. He approached. Helen tilted her head slightly, trying to place the face. There was something in his eyes, something hollowed and hurting. The man took one more step, stopped just short of touching distance, and said quietly, "Are you the woman who fed a little boy behind this building for 10 years? Helen didn't answer right away. Her mouth opened, then closed. But slowly, she nodded. The man's expression broke. His voice caught. "That boy was my grandson." Gas rippled behind them like wind through a field. Someone dropped a wine glass. No one moved.
Helen blinked, stunned. She looked past the man to the other cars still waiting outside. Then the second car door opened and he stepped out, tall now, broader shoulders, clean jeans, hands nervously folded in front of him. But the face was unmistakable. Those eyes, that slight bow of the head, that silent warmth. Time had changed the boy, but only in size. Helen's heart skipped, her breath hitched. "Evan?" she whispered. He stepped closer, still not speaking, just smiling, that soft, private smile that said everything. She took a half step toward him, almost in disbelief. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small wooden box, and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she opened the lid. Inside, a carefully folded yellowed paper. Her handwriting, tilted cursive. Today I packed you an extra milk. Eat well, sweetheart. Don't be afraid. Helen stared at it like it was a relic from another lifetime. Her mouth trembled. You kept this? Evan's voice cracked. I kept all of them. She reached out slowly, her hand brushing his cheek. Look at you, she whispered. You got tall. And then, after more than a decade apart, she pulled him into her arms. It wasn't a hug. It was a homecoming. Her arms around him felt like they were holding time itself together. The room didn't applaud. No one cheered. It was too sacred for that. When they finally parted, Helen looked at the older man, Evan's grandfather. I don't understand, she said softly. Why now? He cleared his throat. Because for 17 years I didn't even know he existed. And the moment I found him, I needed to know who had kept him alive. He looked around the room. Turns out everyone already knew. Everyone but me. Helen nodded slowly, not out of forgiveness, but understanding. Then Richard, Evan's father, stepped forward from the next car. Younger than the grandfather, but with the same eyes. Nervous. Unsure. He took off his glasses, rubbed the back of his neck like he had no idea what to do with his hands. I'm his father, he said quietly. I didn't know she'd had him. Helen looked at him, expression unreadable. You never came back for her, she said, not accusing, just fact. Richard looked down, shame washing over him. I didn't, and it's the biggest mistake of my life. Evan stood beside them, not judging, just listening. Richard took a slow breath. I don't know if I deserve to be part of his life, but I'd like to be, and if nothing else, he looked at Helen again, we'd like you to have this place. The restaurant. As yours. Helen blinked. What? Richard gestured to the walls. This whole place is under your name now, fully. It's legally yours. No tricks, no conditions. But I'm not, she stopped herself. I'm not a business owner. I'm not even, you're the reason my son is alive, Richard said. You're the reason my father got to meet his grandson. You're the reason any of this exists. Then Evan added quietly, and you're the reason I still believe in good people. Helen's mouth opened, then shut. She looked down at the paper in her hand, the same kind she used to fold every night, with tired fingers and aching feet and a heart that refused to give up. And now, here she was, standing inside a restaurant named after her, surrounded by the echoes of kindness she thought had disappeared into nothing. Helen stood at the center of the dining room, still clutching the folded note like it was her compass. The room was silent, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. People were watching her, not as a former employee, not as someone let go after 17 years, but as someone who had mattered. Slowly, gently, she looked around. The soft lighting, the warm wood tones, the new sign above the register. Helen's table. Her name, not in neon, not flashy, but steady, like her. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice thin and cracking. I never wanted anything. I just didn't want a child to go hungry. Richard stepped forward again. And because you never asked for anything, we'd like to give you everything. She looked down again. What would I even do with the restaurant? Evan answered this time. What you always did. Feed people. The Marshall family had already taken care of the legalities. The property was signed over, licenses handled, permits in place. But Helen, she didn't rush. She spent 3 full days just sitting in the empty dining room after hours, watching the walls, remembering the sound of laughter that used to echo off the kitchen tiles. She sat in silence, thinking of every day she had spent behind the stove, every brown bag packed, every note written on the corner of an old recipe page. And then, on the 4th morning, she showed up at 6 a.m. exactly, in her faded apron. She opened the back door, quietly, the same way she had done every day for 10 years. She stood for a moment in the doorway. The alley behind the building had been cleaned.
Painted. But in her mind, she could still see a little boy sitting on a pile of folded cardboard, waiting silently, his small hands trembling from the cold. Helen closed her eyes, took a breath. Then she walked inside and fired up the stove. No announcements, no ribbon cuttings, just heat, onions sizzling in butter, and the familiar comfort of doing the only thing she'd ever wanted to do, feed people. By noon, a quiet line had formed outside. Not of influencers or food bloggers or magazine editors, but families, elderly couples, a tired mother with 3 children, and at the end of the line a young man in a hoodie who looked lost and a little ashamed. He held his hands behind his back, as if not sure if he deserved to be there. Helen saw him through the glass. She walked out. "You hungry?" she asked, same as always. He nodded, eyes wet. "Then come in," she said. "No one goes hungry here." Word spread not because of PR campaigns or fancy ad budgets, but because people could feel it. There was something sacred in the way Helen moved through her kitchen. She didn't just serve food, she served safety, steadiness, dignity. Every day she prepared meals for paying customers, but every evening a quiet system began after the last table cleared. She packed brown paper bags again, one by one, warm sandwiches, a cup of soup, a carton of milk, and every single one came with a note, handwritten in her familiar cursive, "Be safe tonight. You are not alone. Tomorrow's another chance. Eat well, sweetheart. Someone is still rooting for you." People began donating. Some paid for meals in advance. Others dropped off winter coats, gloves, and letters of their own. But Helen never let it become about her. She insisted her name only stayed above the door so that every person who came in could believe something better was still possible. Behind the counter, near the register, Evan installed a small shadow box frame. Inside it was the original note, the first one Helen had ever written him. He hung it beside a photo of the two of them, taken just a week after the restaurant reopened. In the picture, she's holding a ladle. He's holding a tray of bread rolls. Both are smiling, but it's not the kind of smile that seeks attention. It's the kind that says, "We made it," not because of money or bloodlines or luck, but because one person, quietly, every day, chose to be kind. Late one evening, just before closing, Helen sat at the back of the kitchen peeling potatoes. The radio played softly, an old jazz tune from decades ago, the kind her mother used to hum while rolling dough on a floured table. She worked quietly, her rhythm steady, her hands gentle. Then a knock came at the back door. She paused. She hadn't heard that sound in years. Not like this. Not the uncertain, hesitant knock of someone unsure whether they were welcome. Helen wiped her hands, stood up, and opened the door. There, in the dim alley, lit by a single flickering bulb, stood a girl, no older than 16. Thin, pale, a bruise darkening the skin beneath her left eye. Her hoodie was too thin for the season, and her hands were trembling. The girl didn't speak, just looked down. Helen didn't ask questions. She stepped aside. "Come in, sweetheart," she said quietly. "I was just about to start on soup." The girl stepped in without a word, and Helen wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She poured a bowl of chicken stew, toasted 2 pieces of bread, added butter and honey, and placed it in front of the girl at the staff table. No lectures, no interrogation, just warmth. After 10 minutes, the girl finally spoke. "They said someone here helps people." Helen smiled softly. Maybe they were right. That night, after the girl had eaten and fallen asleep on the cot in the break room, Helen sat alone for a long while. Something shifted in her chest. Something slow and deep. She knew this couldn't be just a restaurant anymore. It had to be more. The next morning, she sat with Evan at a small corner table. "I want to start something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I want every single person who's ever felt lost, hungry, unwanted, to know they can come here. Not just for food, for shelter, for safety." Evan didn't hesitate. "Then let's do it." And so, over the next few months, Helen's table quietly expanded. Not with fanfare, but with purpose. The upstairs of the building, once a dusty storage space, was converted into a nighttime shelter. Cots, warm blankets, a rotating staff of volunteers, some of whom had once been guests themselves. A small community pantry opened in the back alley, shelves of canned goods, toiletries, donated clothes, no lock, no guard, just a hand-painted sign, "Take what you need, leave what you can. You're still part of this world." Ivan handled logistics. He brought in a friend who had gone to law school to help navigate permits and city codes. Richard quietly funded the renovations.
But Helen made it clear, no names on plaques, no grand speeches. This isn't charity, it's family. Local schools began sending students for service hours. Churches brought warm coats in the winter. Teenagers painted murals on the walls, images of shared tables, hands passing bread, stars above quiet rooftops. But more than anything, stories began to ripple outward. A woman who had once slept under a freeway now served soup every Thursday. A boy who used to steal apples from the corner store now organized food drives. A man who once sat in silence behind the dumpster brought flowers every week to the front counter, always saying the same thing: "Thank you for not giving up on people like me." And through it all, Helen remained the same, calm, steady, present. She still cooked with her weathered notebook open beside her. She still wrote notes to pack inside brown paper bags. She still wiped down tables herself at night, humming softly. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, a local journalist came in, not with a camera crew, but with a simple notepad. "I've been hearing about this place for months," he said. "It's like everyone who walks in changes." Helen smiled. "We don't change people. We just remind them who they were before the world made them forget." The story he published a week later was titled "The Woman Who Fed Hope." It was shared millions of times. But Helen, as always, barely noticed. She was too busy stirring stew, writing notes, watching the front door to make sure no one walked in looking lost without someone noticing. One rainy evening, Evan found her standing near the back door, looking out at the alley. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She didn't look away from the rain. "I miss him," she said. "The little boy who used to wait right there, not knowing someone loved him already." Evan didn't say anything. He just reached for her hand. "I still carry every note you ever wrote," he said quietly. They stood in silence together. The storm passed outside. But inside Helen's table, the light stayed warm. The soup stayed hot, and kindness, quiet, steadfast kindness, kept changing everything. Months passed. The seasons changed. Helen's table became more than just a restaurant. It became a refuge, a heartbeat in the center of a city that often moved too fast to notice the forgotten. And yet, Helen remained unchanged. No matter how many articles were written, how many awards came in the mail, or how many people offered to elevate the brand, she still wore the same old apron, still used her mother's recipes, still knelt beside anyone who needed help tying their shoes, finding a job, or simply being seen. One afternoon, she was kneading dough by hand when Evan walked in holding a letter. "It's from New York," he said. She raised an eyebrow, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Is it bad news?" He smiled faintly. "That depends. It's from your old in-laws." She paused, then blinked. "I don't have in-laws," she said flatly. "Technically, you do," he replied, holding out the letter. Helen took it, slowly. The handwriting was old-fashioned, formal, sharp. She opened it. Inside was a single page, thick, expensive paper. It read, "We would like to formally request the honor of meeting you. There are things that should have been said long ago. Please allow us the chance to say them now. Gerald and Miriam Marshall." Helen stood still for a long moment. Then she folded the letter neatly and placed it in her apron pocket. That evening, she sat alone in the small courtyard behind the restaurant. The string lights above glowed softly. A few wind chimes tinkled in the breeze. Evan came and sat beside her. "You don't have to go," he said gently. "I know. After all they did." "They're your family too," she interrupted quietly. "They don't need to ask for my forgiveness, Evan. But maybe they need your mother's." Evan looked down. He didn't speak for a while. Then quietly, "She would have liked it here, wouldn't she?" Helen smiled. "She would have cooked circles round me." They laughed softly, and the next morning Helen packed a small suitcase. A week later, she stood in front of the Marshall estate, the place she'd once been told she was not welcome. She remembered the first time she had stood on this very path, clutching a letter in one hand and a child growing quietly inside her. Back then, the gate had remained closed, but now it opened. Waiting for her at the door was an elderly couple, elegant, dignified, but aged in a way grief always leaves its mark. Miriam, once cold and polished, now looked as if the years had softened the steel in her bones. Gerald, ever the quiet patriarch, had no boardroom presence left in his posture. Just a man with his hat in his hands and apology in his eyes. Helen looked at them. They didn't speak right away. Then Miriam, with her voice shaking, said, "We were wrong. About everything." Helen nodded once. "Yes, you were." There was a long silence. Then Gerald stepped forward and held out something wrapped in linen. She unfolded it. It was the last photograph ever taken of her and Evan's mother, framed in walnut. A photo she thought had been destroyed, her hand covering her belly, the faintest curve of a smile on her lips. "We kept this," Gerald said softly, "but we never earned the right to show it." Helen's eyes welled, but she didn't let the tears fall. She simply looked up and said, "I don't want your apologies. I want your help." They looked at her. "I have a dining hall to build for kids who can't afford one, a truck to buy for meals that need to be delivered. I don't need regrets. I need real hands and real work." Gerald smiled faintly. "What do you need us to do?" Helen exhaled. "Come and serve. One shift, no announcements, no titles, just show up." And they did. 2 weeks later, Gerald and Miriam Marshall quietly arrived at Helen's table, put on aprons, and joined the lunch crew. No one recognized them. No one cared. They cleaned trays, carried soup, sat and listened to the stories of people they had never thought about before. That day, something old was laid to rest, not with speeches, not with headlines, but with a quiet, humbled "I'm sorry," delivered through acts of kindness. Afterward, Helen sat in the back, sipping tea with Miriam. "You could have hated us," Miriam whispered. "I did," Helen replied honestly. "But hate doesn't feed children." She looked out the window. And Evan didn't need hate. He needed warmth. The two women sat quietly, side by side. Not friends. Not yet. But something else. Two mothers, with more between them than words could ever untangle. That night, when the doors of Helen's table closed, the lights inside still glowed. Because by now, it was more than a place. It was a promise. That the world could be cruel, yes. But it could also heal. If someone, somewhere, chose kindness. Every single day. Years flowed gently after the day. Helen's table stood not just as a restaurant, but as a movement. Word of its origin spread slowly, not because of marketing, but because kindness, when real, has a way of traveling on its own. Students came to study her handwritten recipes. Churches, schools, and shelters wrote on asking how they could start something similar. But Helen? She stayed the same. She still arrived early, her step steady, still wore her faded apron and tied her hair the same way her mother had shown her, still folded the day's first brown paper bag with care, just in case someone needed it. There were days when she didn't speak more than a few words. There were nights she went home with sore legs, aching knees, and tear-streaked cheeks. But not once did she wonder if it had been worth it. Evan came by often. He never stopped calling her Miss Helen, even though the world now called her things like founder, hero, and mother of the movement. She would always chuckle at that. "I'm just a cook," she'd say. "Nothing more." He would smile and quietly add, "and nothing less." One evening, after the restaurant had closed and the lights had dimmed, Helen sat alone at the last table near the window. Outside, the city shimmered in gold and silver reflections, as quiet and alive. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled note, one of the many Evan had returned to her years ago. Her eyes scanned the faded ink. "Eat well, sweetheart. Don't be afraid." Her hands trembled, not from age, from awe. Awe that something so small, half a sandwich, a folded note, a quiet act, had echoed so far and so wide. She looked up. Framed on the restaurant wall was a photograph. It was taken on the day of the grand reopening. In the center stood Helen, holding the small box with her note inside. Behind her, Evan, Richard, Gerald, the staff, the children, all smiling, all real, all home. She stood, turned off the last light, and whispered to the quiet room, "Sleep well, darlings. See you in the morning." And then she walked out into the night, a simple woman, with an extraordinary heart, a reminder to the world that compassion, quiet, steadfast, unshakable, is never wasted. And somewhere far away, a little boy folded a paper note into his pocket and walked bravely into the future.